Today, you'll hear three incredible stories of what happens when brave tank crews face overwhelming odds and fight to the end in fierce, close-quarters battles, with their tank being the only thing standing between them and certain death. So, let's get started. Number 1. Fray Bentos, World War I. This is the British Mark IV mail tank that, with its 8-member crew, held off the German army for 60 hours during the horrific Battle of Passchendaele. It was August 1917, and the crew of the tank called Fray Bentos couldn't even imagine the horrors that were about to unfold. Fray Bentos was one of several British tanks assigned to support the infantry in the assault on German positions. They had to cross a battlefield that had been extensively shelled for 3 weeks, and with heavy rain turning it into a sea of mud. Captain Richardson was guiding the tank from outside, literally walking alongside it. As the tank advanced, it encountered a German machine gun nest and destroyed it with its quick-firing 6-pounder cannons and Lewis machine guns. However, they soon faced even stronger enemy fire. The captain, who was outside the tank, was shot in the leg, and the driver, Lieutenant George Hill, was wounded in the neck, causing the tank to lose control and slide into a ditch. Sergeant Robert Misson and Lance Corporal Breda climbed out on the roof of the tank to begin the unditching procedure, but the Germans opened fire again, killing Breda while Misson managed to jump back inside. The rest of the crew from the trapped tank opened fire with all their weapons on the German positions. However, the British infantry attack was heavily beaten back, and the soldiers retreated to their lines, leaving the stuck Fray Bentos and its crew alone in no man's land, resting partly on top of a German trench. The German infantry then launched a counterattack to recapture the lost position, and the tank was in the worst spot possible. The British crew fought ferociously from inside the tank, killing dozens of Germans, but eventually the Germans got close enough to swarm the tank. They tried to put stick grenades inside and even managed to drop one in, but the crew miraculously threw it out before it exploded. At this point, almost all the crew members of Fray Bentos were wounded, fighting from their tank like it was a bunker in the middle of the German positions, completely surrounded. Despite being heavily outnumbered, the crew miraculously inflicted heavy casualties on the Germans and defended themselves relatively well. However, they knew they couldn't hold out in this position for long. No one could have predicted what would happen over the next 3 days and 2 nights during 60 hours of constant fighting, not just with the enemy. The crew of Fray Bentos continued to repel attack after attack, but they gradually ran out of water, food, and ammunition. They drank water from the tank's radiators and even filthy water from the mud of the battlefield. Even British snipers targeted them, confusing them with the enemy trying to steal parts of the tank. After the 3rd day, it was clear they couldn't hold out any longer, and it was better to die trying to escape than to wait for the inevitable. The crew disabled the tank's guns and prepared weapons for a breakout. At 9 p.m. on August 24th, they began their slow and painful journey back, crawling wounded through enemy positions, somehow avoiding capture. Misson went first to alert the British infantry on the front line so they wouldn't be shot by friendly fire. The rest of the men exited the tank one by one in complete silence and began crawling. After many hours, and only the crew knowing how they did it, 7 men eventually made it back to the British side and were taken to an aid station. 6 of the 8 men who went into the mission that day survived the war, and every member of the Fray Bentos crew was awarded for their actions and bravery. Number 2. The Last Tiger of Berlin. This story is from the Second World War, during one of the very last battles in Europe. As the war neared its end, the situation for the German soldiers was catastrophic. The Allies had reached Berlin from all sides, and it was only a matter of time before the resistance would be crushed. However, some surviving King Tigers managed to reach Berlin and make their last stand in a horrific fight. 12 King Tigers from the battle-hardened SS Heavy Panzer Battalion positioned their tanks strategically in pairs of 2 and waited for the Soviet forces' advance, serving as the last defense of Hitler's bunker. The tanks were placed in front of city squares and train stations where they had a wide field of fire and could protect all the approaches that Allied tanks had to cross, inflicting heavy casualties. 2 King Tigers, numbers 314 and 100, attacked Soviet armor and fought all day against waves of T-34s and JS-2s until they were pushed back to Potsdamer Platz. The next morning, Soviet tanks broke into the central government district, and Tiger No. 100 was hit in its right track, immobilizing it. Later that day, Red Army infantry emerged from a sewer manhole and swarmed the tank. The terrified German crew managed to fight them off, but by the end of the day, they were almost completely out of ammunition and had to abandon their tank under the cover of darkness with no means to protect it. Now, the last Tiger of Berlin, No. 314, was on its own. By this point, its crew had knocked out 39 Soviet tanks, and still, they had no intention of surrendering. It was decided that the remaining force would try to break through and push their way north of Berlin. All remaining operational vehicles, including the last Tiger, were assembled. At 9 p.m., a group of hundreds of German infantry and civilians, with the King Tiger leading the charge, pushed across the Weidendamme Bridge. They went straight through heavy Soviet fire, with many being mowed down. The King Tiger managed to reach the Luftwaffe flak tower, which was still fighting, but hit one of their own mines, which disabled the tank. The crew was then forced to finally abandon the tank after holding the last line for so long. The crew survived the war, and the tank was later scrapped by the Red Army. Number 3. KV-2 that earned the enemy's respect. On June 24, 1941, during a fierce battle between the Germans and the Soviet Union, one Soviet tank crew did something that would end in the most unexpected way. While the rest of the Soviet forces were retreating in the face of a massive German attack, this crew operating a KV-2 tank chose to somehow stop the German advance long enough for reinforcements to arrive, or at least allow most of their comrades to retreat safely. By this point, Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union, was in full swing. The German 6th Panzer Division was part of a massive force driving deep into Soviet territory. Over 250 German tanks were making their way through the area, and from the opposite direction, a lone Soviet tank rolled out. The KV-2 was a massive, heavily armored tank that the Germans had never faced before. In fact, most of the German weapons at the time couldn't penetrate its armor. When the KV-2 showed up on the battlefield, it shocked the Germans how none of their weapons could destroy it, even at point-blank range. They had to bring in powerful 88mm flak cannons to deal with it. During the night of June 23rd, a lone KV was seen calmly positioning itself beside the road, traversing its gun in the direction of the expected German advance. From that point on, the tank didn't move, and no one was seen around it, leading German reconnaissance to believe it had broken down and been abandoned. However, when a convoy of German trucks approached the next day, the tank's turret suddenly moved, started raining 152mm high explosive shells. Within a few minutes, 12 German trucks were burning, blocking the entire road. 4 50mm anti-tank guns were dispatched and started firing, but the crews were shocked that they couldn't even scratch the KV. Then the powerful 88mm anti-aircraft gun was brought in. The crew of the KV watched the gun move to within 700 yards. As the crew of the flak prepared to fire, the Soviet tank fired a single shell, hitting the gun directly. They waited for the last moment to maximize their chance of hitting it before the Germans could fire back. Several infantry attacks were sent to swarm the tank, but all of them failed. Furious, the Germans had to wait for nightfall to try again, but they still failed to do anything. The next morning, a column of panzers was mobilized to distract the tank while a group of infantry with explosives crept up from the opposite side. Sadly for the Soviet tankers, the plan was successful, and one of the Germans managed to drop explosives into the tank, which detonated seconds later, ending the last stand of its brave 6-member crew. A German colonel, impressed by their bravery, ordered the remains of the fallen tank crew to be buried with full military honors, and they were transferred to a cemetery in Raseiniai in 1965, though their names remain unknown.